Cruel intentions. Sarah Boone, 47, was sentenced to life in prison after she was found guilty of second-degree murder for zipping her boyfriend, George Torres Jr., into a suitcase, leaving him inside for hours until he suffocated and died. Her downfall, apart from letting him beg for his life, recording videos of herself, taunting him, saying, "That's what you get. That's what I feel like when you cheat on me." Boone claims she thought he escaped because two of his fingers stuck out. She hit them with a baseball bat, hoping they would retract. They thought it would be funny to hop in a suitcase as part of the game, according to an arrest affidavit from the Orange County Sheriff's Office. Instead of calling the police while he's essentially contained inside the suitcase, Boone goes to bed. The next morning, she's terrified for a different reason when she realizes that her boyfriend is lifeless and attempts CPR on him. Then she lies to police because she doesn't want to be arrested. During her trial, Boone claims she suffered from battered spouse syndrome, telling the jury, "I forgive myself for falling in love with a monster," right? And no matter how grotesque he may become, I still loved him, hooked him, forgave him. The jury heard about his past domestic violence acts, how he once nearly stabbed Boone with a butcher knife and bruised her ribs so badly she was hospitalized. He also apparently once stabbed her in the femur, and she almost bled to death. The question on everyone's mind, including the jury's, was, why didn't Boone leave? Why did she tolerate and endure this kind of abuse? Because the victim always hopes that the person will change. They believe that if they can just be better, do better, their situation will be better. So why do some battered spouse syndrome defenses succeed while others fail? The answer lies in the consistency of the narrative, the immediacy of the threat, and, of course, the defendant's credibility. In Boone's case, despite her expert's testimony that she suffered from battered spouse syndrome, which was corroborated by the prosecution's expert, the evidence itself undermined Boone's defense, leaving the jury with little doubt about her intent. But here's the rub. Battered spouse syndrome, a psychological condition that stems from profound abuse in an intimate relationship, can profoundly impact a person's psychological state, potentially leading to irrational, extreme, even cruel behavior. It's characterized by fear, helplessness, and the belief that escape is impossible. Survivors may in some cases reach a breaking point where the psychological toll of abuse overwhelms them, triggering behavior that seems extreme, sometimes framed as temporary insanity. In some cases, prolonged exposure to cruelty can normalize certain behaviors. This doesn't necessarily mean that the person becomes their abuser, but it does reflect the complex and damaging psychological imprint of prolonged abuse. The idea of the monster within, where the victim essentially becomes like her monster. This is a thing. Survivors may struggle with internalized rage, helplessness, self-loathing that manifests outwardly. In the legal arena, battered spouse syndrome can provide crucial context for self-defense claims, even when the victim's actions might seem premeditated or excessive, as in Boone's case. But take the case of Francine Hughes, the subject of the book and the film The Burning Bed. In 1977, after years of severe abuse, Francine set fire to the bed where her ex-husband was sleeping. Her defense argued temporary insanity stemming from battered spouse syndrome, and the jury found her not guilty. The evidence of prolonged abuse and her inability to escape played a key role. And then there's, of course, R.V. Lavallee in Canada. Angelique Lavallee fatally shot her partner after he threatened to kill her. An expert testimony about battered spouse syndrome explained how Angelique's actions were shaped by her trauma and belief in imminent danger. This case set a precedent for allowing psychological evidence in self-defense claims. But unlike Hughes or Lavallee, Boone's attempt to use battered spouse syndrome as part of her defense fell flat. Why? Well, the answer lies in the evidence itself. First, the inconsistencies in Boone's story were glaring. Initially, she described the incident as a drunken game of hide-and-seek gone wrong. Later, she claimed self-defense, saying she suffered from battered spouse syndrome after enduring abuse from Torres. These shifting narratives hurt her credibility with the jury because they really didn't know what to believe. Second, there was damning video evidence. If you're going to claim battered spouse syndrome, don't record yourself, right? Footage from Boone's phone showed Torres trapped in the suitcase, begging for help. Her response, mocking him. She's heard saying things like, "That's what you do when you choke me." This didn't align with the image of a victim acting out of fear for her life. Instead, it painted a picture of deliberate cruelty and premeditation. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict, unconvinced that Sarah Boone's actions were driven by fear or self-defense. Instead, they thought it suggested malice and cruelty. So a better of a defense strategy for Sarah Boone would have been to lean into the accident defense, right? Maintaining her initial claim that the death was a tragic, drunken game of hide and seek gone wrong. And to strengthen that narrative, all she needed to do is keep her story consistent and avoid shifting to a self-defense claim later, because inconsistency ultimately undermined credibility. And then you have the forensic evidence demonstrating a lack of prior planning or malicious intent could have supported this angle, emphasizing the effects of alcohol on her judgment, right? Presenting her behavior as panicked rather than premeditated might have also bolstered her argument. I mean, that's plausible, right? If an accident defense was not viable, her legal team could have focused on mitigating circumstances to reduce the charges. For example, highlighting Boone's intoxication to argue that her decision making was impaired. That would have led to a lesser charge, perhaps manslaughter, maybe even negligent homicide. I mean, framing her actions as reckless but unintended, right? Maybe during the consequence of a heated argument. Maybe the jury would have believed that. Maybe it would have convinced them to maybe return something less deliberate. Another possible approach could have been to argue psychological or emotional distress, right? Instead of relying solely on battered spouse syndrome, Boone's team might have presented evidence of generalized emotional distress or a psychologically altered state of mind at the time. Now, if abuse by George Torres Jr. was verifiable, using it as context for Boone's mental state, not as justification, but as explanation, could have swayed the jury toward understanding rather than condemnation. So it's all in how you present the narrative, right? The defense also could have worked to dismantle the prosecution's story, particularly the argument of premeditation. They could have challenged that by emphasizing the lack of evidence for prior planning, right? The fact that Boone actually called 911. They could have said that her phone call to 911 was a sign of panic, which might have created doubt in the jury's mind. Even the damaging video evidence of Boone mocking Torres could have been reframed, for instance, as dark humor, typical of a toxic relationship or a result of intoxication, to downplay the intentionality of her words. I mean, if the evidence against Boone was overwhelming, maybe it was in this case, then pursuing a plea bargain might have been her best option, right? Negotiating for a reduced charge like manslaughter, negligent homicide, maybe avoid a murder conviction, potentially resulting in a lighter sentence. Ultimately, it would have been a stronger defense, right? Because you would have focused on credibility and coherence. By sticking to a singular focused strategy, Boone's legal team might have provided a plausible explanation for her actions and cast doubt on the prosecution's version. But in this case, they didn't do that, and Boone suffered the consequences. And here's another critical error, I believe, that happened in this case. In advancing a self-defense claim of battered spouse syndrome, Boone had to testify. And so the last thing you want your client to do is testify, right? You don't want them to get on the stand and be subject to cross-examination, because Boone's shifting narratives and the damaging video evidence made her a potentially risky witness, right? Taking the stand, the prosecution's gonna highlight her inconsistencies. They're gonna undermine her credibility. I mean, if the defense had opted for accident or emotional distress, Boone could have remained silent, and that's what you want. You want your client to sit at the table and shut up, right? I mean, that's what I would have done, because even her experts, right, who claimed that, yeah, she probably did suffer from battered spouse syndrome, they didn't help her case. Instead, they made it less likely that she actually suffered from this. I mean, that she actually did this out of, duress or stress. So the jury wasn't able to minimize her damaging testimony. And basically, Boone sunk herself. Thanks for listening. If you liked what you heard, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. It helps me grow and bring you more crime bites like this. Meanwhile, stay informed, stay vigilant, and above all, stay safe.